Okay, let's start with drums. So just to build some context here of what we're mixing here, we've got a beautiful Ludwig kit here, as you can see, and we've got a kick, 2 toms, a snare, and then some overheads for our cymbals, and that's pretty much it. Nothing crazy. There is one extra little flavor thing that I like to add, which is this mic TS from Roland, and what this is actually just a single channel, single sample player for the snare. And what we do is we actually have some samples that we've loaded onto it that we like to blend in. More on that a little bit later. But for now, let's start with what microphones we have on our kit. So on our kick, we've got a D6 as the out mic, a 91 on the inside. We've got 2 D4s on the toms, 1 on each, 57s on top and bottom of our snare, and we have a pair of C214s as our overhead mics. There is a hi-hat mic, but we're not going to be using it today because, honestly, it didn't sound that great, and I don't ever usually use a hi-hat mic unless it's for recording. So we're going to just ignore that for today. So let's listen to our kick mic, and we'll start there because that's where most of the foundation of a good drum mix comes from, is your kick as well as your snare. So we've got those 2 mics, our 91 and our D6. Let's listen to that 91, which is our kick in mic, and we're just going to listen to what it sounds like. So right away, the first things I notice are we're hearing the nice, beautiful attack of the kick drum because that microphone's right there up by the beater. But I'm also hearing a lot of cymbal bleeds, so we're definitely going to need to gate this mic. The other thing, too, is that there's a little bit of low end in there that I don't want to necessarily use because I know I've got another mic that's going to be doing that job and usually doing a better job. So we'll go ahead and cut that information out. So let's take a listen to what we're going to do here with our processing. So the first thing I always will do is apply a little bit of a high pass filter, especially in the case of this because I don't want all that low end. So let's bring it up. And let's engage the high pass filter. And I'm doing it about 100 hertz because I know that my subs and crossover range is around that spot. So I don't want all the information cut out. I just want it to start cutting it out there because I know I'm going to get most of it from my other mic. I want them to work together and help each other out, but I want the majority of that sound and tone coming from my D6. Okay, so that's good. Let's actually add our EQ. Now, I'm going to jump to EQ first in this instance because I find that trying to EQ a gated kick, it's a little bit more of a challenge than trying to do it, before you gate it. Even though our EQ is applied after the gate here in this instance, I want to hear what I'm doing first to the sound and tonality of the kick before I do the gate. Because I also know that that gate's going to change a little bit of the characteristics of it too, depending on the attack and release settings. More on that in a moment, but let's listen to what our EQ is. Now, I've already got one pulled up here, and as you can see, there's already quite a bit of some cuts happening here. So let's listen to what it sounds like with it in and with it out, and then we'll break down what's happening. So here's that kick without that EQ, and with it in. Back out, and in. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, we're doing a lot of tone shaping here. Not that the kick drum didn't sound bad already. What we're doing is we're trying to use this microphone in EQ to pick out exactly what we want it to do and focus on. So that way we can use that to blend with our other microphone so we can kind of pick and choose the tonality we want depending on the song. So when we get to blending the 2 kick drums, you'll hear what I'm talking about there. But for now, what we're doing is this. We've got about 150 hertz. We've got a duck there. That's usually kind of like a mid-range tone that I want to usually duck out just on this inside microphone because I know I'm going to have a lot of that in my D6. We've also got a big dip at 300, almost 400 hertz, which that's a common dip that you're going to see amongst most drum heads in general, kick, snare, toms. And that's just because there's a lot of buildup in that range naturally. And so we're going to pull that out just to make room for things because we know we've got a bunch of other instruments like guitars and keyboards that are going to need that space. So we're going to cut that out. It also tends to just remove some of the boxiness of the drum kits. Then we've also got a cut at a little over 2K. That's just kind of some of the bite. I found that some of this microphone felt a little bit too attacky, too clicky. So I pulled that out. And then I also did the same thing around 4K. So we're actually going to flatten the EQ out, and I'm going to let you hear each piece coming in so you can kind of hear that shape changing. So we're going to go in and flatten everything here. So bring this up, this one, and this one. And it's just going to be rough. All right, let's listen to what it sounds like now. All right, so the first one I'll usually gravitate towards is that 400 hertz, so let's dig that out. That's a big difference already. Here's before. Kind of sounds like a cardboard box. Boom. There's like a thickness that just got added to it already. And now we're going to pull just a little bit out of that 150, just because we know we're going to have double of that almost coming from the D6. We'll go to the high mid here, which has got 2K, just to soften that high end. And then a little bit at 4. Okay, great. That seems really good. That's a great starting point for this. Let's move on to our gate. So our gate is going to be set here to only open up when that kick gets hit. There's a little bit of a hold time just to let it ring out, but because kicks are just a more transient sound, it's just like an instant boom, and that's it. We don't need it to hold up for too long. So let's just take a listen to what we got. Before the gate. Okay, so right away, we're hearing it open, close. That one section there where it was going duh, 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 it was happening so fast that we really weren't cutting anything, which in the context of a Sunday service in the PA, that's fine. I'm not too worried about it being perfect. If this was a recording, however, I may go back in there and actually manually cut those parts out. But for what we're doing here, and that I only want it to open when it's hit initially, we're doing the job well. All right, so let's talk about our attack, hold, and release settings for a moment here. If you remember previously, attack tends to be what allows how quickly it to open up. And so if you have a fast attack, you're going to hear that initial transient, which we want in a kick drum here. We want to hear that initial snap, especially on an inside mic. So we're going really fast here with that cranked up almost to all the way open as fast as it can go. Then we've got our hold setting at about 150 milliseconds, and that's just giving us just enough time to hear it open and actually wait for the next kick to come through before it closes again, because there's going to be times where, like you just heard, where they're going to go duh, 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 or really fast on the kick drum. You want to still have a little bit of it open, because I don't want to hear that gate trying to open and close, open and close, open and close real fast to try and keep up. I'd rather it just stay open for me in this context. Now, like I said earlier, on a live record, it might make more sense to just go in there and clean up every single one of those hits. But for this context, totally fine. Lastly, we've got a release, and it's set pretty quickly at 100 milliseconds. That's quick in my book. A lot of other people might say it's slow. I just like to let it kind of drown out, especially because I know I've got those cymbal mics coming in, so I'd rather it feel a little bit more natural, like it's decaying with the cymbals, versus it being this snapping close sound. I find that with any kind of gate on a live drum kit, especially when you have a lot of cymbal bleed like we have here right now, I find that it sounds a little bit better if you let it kind of drown out with, or fade out with the cymbals naturally. So let's listen again one more time, and then we're going to move on to compression. All right, so let's move on to compression. Now, when it comes to compression on drums, little goes a long way. Now, we are going to be using some different compressors than what we used previously, and that's because, one, I just don't like using the stock compressors on this board. I find that they don't sound that great compared to their analog-looking counterparts. So this is actually a analog model of an old-school compressor that's very famous from the studio days back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it's still used today on just about every record. And we're going to use a couple of these different ones on this mix tutorial because they just sound so much better, and I find that they actually are pretty easy to use compared to the other ones because the controls are a little bit more simplified. Now, all of the same stuff that we learned from earlier in this course still apply here, but some things are pick and choose depending on what you have available to you to work with. So if you need a refresher on how to use compressors and how that all works, go back and watch that video again, and trust me, it will make sense when you get into this section. And I'm going to go through and really try and explain what these compressors are doing and how they're thinking, because they are a little bit different than what we worked with previously. Now, again, the reason why I want to use these is because I find that they sound much better than the stock ones, and I find that these plugins are pretty available now on most common digital boards these days, either built into your board or as an added extra cost like it is with the Allen Heath series here, where you have to purchase it as like a plugin. Or if you're ready for it and you can upgrade, you can get a wave system or even some other kind of system that can run plugins on a computer outside of your board and use it as an insert. We do that here, and we'll do a later video on that some other point. But this whole concept of using these analog compressors is just because they sound much better than the usual stock ones, and they work well. So let's look at what we've got to work with here today. This is probably one of the coolest compressors out there, and this is the 1176. Now, this one has been around for a long time, and it is most popular for rock vocals and guitars and drums. I don't know if there's a record out there that, you know, made it to the top of the charts that doesn't have at least one of these on their records, because they just sound so good. So let's talk about the controls real fast, and then we'll get into actually dialing this thing in. So this system uses a input-output system to control how much compression there is, almost like the threshold. You see on a normal compressor like we've worked with in the past, the threshold is what point do we start compressing. In this system, it's actually set at its own setting inside. We can't touch it, but what we can do is drive the signal into the circuitry more. So the more input we put into it, the harder it's going to work and slam on that compressor, versus if we turn the input down, it's not going to work as much. Now, when you do that, when you input more signal into it, you have to balance it. So if you have a ton of signal going into it and it's super loud, you're going to need to turn the output down to gain match with what the original sound source was. And I'll let you hear what that sounds like in a moment. Now, there's also our attack and release settings, and on this compressor, they're a little bit different. 1 is the slowest setting, 7 is the fastest setting. These aren't milliseconds, these are just a variable tuning you have between the slowest and fastest. And the same thing is again with the release. 1 is slow, 7 is fastest. Now, the attack on this compressor is extremely fast, extremely fast. So be careful with putting this thing all the way up, because you're going to get every little bit of attack out of this thing cranked up. I tend to run things closer to noon to maybe 6, 7 if I really have an aggressive singer who I need to tame. Now, with the buttons on the side that say 4, 8, 12, and 20, those are our ratios. You remember earlier we had the options on our other compressor to go 1.5 to 2 to 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. This one, you're stuck with these 4 options plus this crazy all button mode, which you'll see here. And that is based off of the old original hardware, where some guys figured out that if you pressed all 4 of the buttons together, they gave you this really wild sounding ratio. I'm not exactly sure what the ratio is. I don't know if they actually know. Maybe someone does. But basically, it was this old school way of getting this really wild sound compression setting that I don't use in the live context here, but maybe in the right section it would. So I'm going to go for a 4 to 1 here on this setup, and we are going to just listen to what this compression sounds like on our kick drum. So first, without the compressor. And bring it in. Back out. And back in. Okay, let's talk about what we heard. I don't know about you, but to me, that sounded like our kick drum got a little bit thicker. It almost has like a gluey texture to it, which in this case would be really good because we want that kind of subby information. Not all of it, because obviously we're going to have a D6 that's going to be covering that information, but just like the snap in the mid-range of this kick drum all of a sudden has this kind of like thickness to it, which I really like. And we're going to do the same thing with our other microphone to really kind of glue it together. So it also just kind of brings some consistency to the hits, because now, you know, those big hits are going to get pulled back quite a bit, but the smaller hits are going to level out more. So we're going for about a 3 to 5 dB compression here, and it's quite a bit, but you also see that it's releasing relatively quickly, so that way we can hear the aftermath of that initial transient getting hit being squashed. And you'll see also the attack is not set super high here. It's fast, but it's not the fastest, and that's because I still want to have that initial hit coming through my PA. If I were to have my attack all the way up, it's going to just squash that, and I don't want that. I want to hear that click, because that's the job of this 91. So let's listen to what everything sounded like before, and then what it sounds like now. So we'll turn everything off. This is what we started with. And now. Okay, so that sounds really great. Let's bring in our outside microphone, and we're going to listen to it by itself without anything applied to it first, and then we'll go from there. Okay, this sounds already pretty good to start off with. It's a great spot. There's definitely some low mids that need to be dipped out because there's a lot of that buildup in there. Definitely gonna need to gate this thing because we need to tame the cymbals, and some gating and compression is gonna go a long way here. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. Now, the first thing I've got is a high pass filter. I'm a guy who likes to use high pass filters on just about every input, just because I know there's always a chance that some sub information can come in there that I don't want, even if it's a DI source. I try to just know that I'm going to cut out 20, 30, 40 hertz at most, just because I don't want it to accidentally muddy things up without me knowing. Now, there are some times where I won't do that, but in this case, I do want to do that because I know my subs can't even hit this stuff, and I don't want to send information to it that it's going to try and reproduce that it can't. So I've actually got my high pass filter here set to 20 hertz roughly, and that's just because I know that's where my cutoff is for sure in my system. It could maybe do 30 hertz, but 20 hertz is a good starting point for me in my book. All right, let's listen to it now with our EQ. So our EQ, you can see here, is pretty different than what we had previously, and that's just because we got to shape what we hear, not what we see. So just because it's the same instrument doesn't mean that's going to get the same treatment with a different mic. What we're doing here is we're actually focusing on the low mid punch and the low sub information. So you'll see here I've actually got a boost at around 40 hertz, that duck again at 250 almost, and then we're actually cutting some of the top end out just to make room for that 91 inside mic. So let's listen to it before and after. So right away you can tell that there's a bunch of low end information in there, and we made room for that clickiness of that 91 by trimming off that high end. Let me go ahead and show you again what that low mid band's doing there, because I feel like this is a real key thing. It's kind of honky, kind of cardboardy. It just cleans it up. Now, this option here of boosting this low frequency is totally up to you. I felt in my mix, in my context, on my PA, it made sense, but that may not be your case. You may actually have more or less, where you may need to cut more, or you may need to boost more, or maybe not at all. It's up to what you hear. So what I heard in my room was I needed to boost this up just to get it to sit in the mix right. All right, let's bring in the gate. Same thing as before. The only difference here is we've slowed the attack down. And that's because I don't want as much of that initial transient hit or the attack from it to come through, because I know that my 91 is going to cover that. So we've slowed it down to almost 10 milliseconds. So that's what the gate's doing. Let's go to the compressor. Our compressor's kind of modeled the same way in that we've got a decently fast attack. Our release is pretty quick. And we've got an 8-to-1 setting on this one just because I wanted a little bit more ducked out of this one between hits, because I wanted the attack to be cutting out more, and I wanted the rest of the kit, or the rest of the sound, to come up right afterwards. So here's with it out and in. Now we're doing about a 10 dB reduction, which now that we're listening to it, I think might actually have been a little bit too much. So let's actually adjust that. Let's grab our input and output knobs. And what I like to do is I like to set it where I have, because I've got two different knobs here, I can actually set one to be on the input and one to be on the output. So I can kind of do this motion where I can turn the input down. And I'm looking at my meter here and seeing how much I'm cutting. I'm trying to get closer to 5. Okay, and then let's check it out without it on. Hear the gain difference. Interesting, it's about the same. Okay, I think we're good. So that's gain matched right there. We don't need to adjust it too much, which is awesome. So let's listen to these two kick drums mics in contact with each other. So I'm gonna bring them in together and let's take a listen. Okay, let's listen to just the kick in and the out together. Now, let's say, for example, I wanted to soften the kick sound a little bit, make it not as bitey. Now I can bring this fader down instead of going into my EQ, and I can just unblended a little bit. Or I can really punch that top end so I can hear it over the rest of the band and then bring it back down when it's time. So that's kind of the flexibility of having two kick mics, that you not only get like two different tones and sounds, but you can also choose how much of one or the other you're hearing, and you can change it throughout your worship set, because one song may demand a more punchy kick drum while another one may need a subby, more thuddy kind of kick drum. And you can do that without having to go into EQs and changing everything. It's as simple as just raising and lowering a fader. Now, there is one thing that we didn't touch real fast, which is going to be polarity. So let's talk about phase and making sure that our kick drum mics are together in phase. So as you can see, I've actually already got my polarity light on there, and that's because I've flicked it on earlier, knowing that my kick drum mics weren't quite in phase with each other. But let's take a listen to what they sound like with it on and with it off. So we'll undo it. All right, I don't know if you heard the difference there, but when we took it off, I personally felt like a lot of the low and low mids suddenly just disappeared. And we had the super subby information and the more tacky bright information, but we didn't have anything else in the middle, which I know is what I actually want in this instance. So keeping the polarity flipped and setting it there seemed to do the trick for what I needed. Now, your results may vary, where your kick drum may be, bigger or smaller, or your microphones are just perfectly out of phase and they need to be flipped, or maybe they're perfectly in phase and they don't need to be flipped. It is always going to be dependent on what your context is for your setup. So my advice when it comes to polarity flipping is this: get your kick drum mics set up where each one sounds great, but then listen to them together in context, and then listen to them with one of the microphones phase flipped. And if it sounds better, keep it phase flipped. But if it sounds worse, undo it and move on. Simple as that. Okay, we spent a lot of time in the kick drum, so let's keep moving. Let's go into the snare. Now, we've got two microphones on here. We've got our top and bottom. Our top one's going to be most of our sound, because that's where we get the big, thick tone out of a snare, the initial crack of it. But then the bottom mic's also doing a job, too, in that it's picking up the snare wires and kind of the rattle of it. So let's listen to our top mic first and go from there. All right, so the first few things I noticed, obviously gate needs to be implied, because we've got a lot more cymbals in there now because we got a microphone closer to them. Also got some weird ring and rattle that we'll need to help out. Sounds like the snare may have gotten out of tune halfway through the set, which happens. And then we need to compress it a little bit to just kind of thicken it up. All right, let's get to it. So first things first, I'm going to apply a high-pass filter. Yes, high-pass filter on the snare. 60 hertz is what I've chosen for this time. Kind of changes depending on how it sounds and how it feels. I do like a more beefier, thicker, low-end snare sound, so I don't always cut all the way to the top, but I do want some of that information going to my low-end side of my mix. So 60 hertz is what I've chosen. We've also then got 100 hertz boosted just a little bit, just to kind of hear that beef. I've, again, cut out around 200 hertz, a little bit narrower of a cue this time, just because I still want to have some of the surrounding information in there. There's another one at 450, which is going to probably be a little bit more of that boxiness in the snare drum. Since it's a smaller drum, it's going to be a little bit higher up in the frequency range. And then I've got a boost at about 3.5K, which is going to give us a little bit more of the crack and the sparkle on top. So let's listen to it without everything, and then we'll bring in the high pass and then the EQ. Okay, so as we're listening here, that little ring in there, that that's going to need to go away. So let's go grab our low mid and let's sweep it down and see if it's down there somewhere. Yep, that's where it was. Just a little bit down there, not too far off from where we started. Probably again because the snare was tuned up a little bit, and then over time throughout the set, it got detuned just because the lugs didn't stay tight on it. So that happens. That's okay. All right, let's bring in a gate. I've got the gate on this thing, the attack cranked as fast as it can go because I want to hear that punch. I want to hear that snap. I want that gate to open as quickly as possible. Release is probably the slowest thing on here just because I want to hear that snare ring out a little bit. And because it's closer to the cymbals, I also want to hear some of the cymbals fading out with it. So it feels more a part of the kit and not feel like this, like, because I find that like when you have a kit sound overall play and you hear the cymbals just go because like the snare mic's opening or the tom mic's opening and letting it in and then it stops, I find it gets really distracting because you can tell something's not right. But by letting it release slowly and kind of fading out, it fades out with the natural decay of those cymbals as well a little bit. Okay, lastly, let's get our compressor dialed in. Again, 1176, medium attack, fast release because I want it to just grab the initial transient and then let the rest of the snare sing. So let's just hear it. Take it out. Now, as you can hear, there is a little bit of a con to using this compressor in the way I've done it, in that I'm driving it pretty heavy into the system, and that's because I want to get that thickness and that tone out of this 1176. But the problem is that I'm getting a lot more of that cymbal bleed in there, so it is a trade-off that I have to consider. But I found that it's worth doing in this context. Your results may vary. So if you find that maybe it's too much cymbal bleed, maybe pull back on your compression a little bit and go from there. Okay, let's listen to the snare bottom. This one's going to be interesting because this one does not have nearly as much happening here because it's just picking up the snare wires. But let's take a listen. Okay, so we can hear the kick kind of rattling the snares a little bit. We can hear some cymbals, obviously. There's some low-end information that we definitely don't need. So let's just go ahead and get that high-pass filter going. I've already got mine set at about 230. Now, you can kind of hear there's a little bit of some boxiness that just got added to it. And that's just because we're focusing now on those frequencies. So on our EQ, we're going to cut 240, 1.5K, and about 5K just to kind of soften up some of the top end. I'm going to actually not boost, but I'm just going to release some of that EQ back from that 5K. I think it needs a little bit more of that bite. Okay, let's bring a gate in. And that gate actually, let me show you here, that gate is actually sidechained to the snare top mic. And that's just because I want that snare top mic to be the one that's driving the bottom snare mic opening. Now, if I find that my drummer's a little more dynamic in their playing, I might not do that and let it just sidechain to itself, meaning that it's listening to just the snare bottom mic and not the snare top. So that way I can pick up on some of the rattles and ghost notes, if you will, of this I'm hitting the snare lightly. But for this drummer, I chose to have it on the snare top because I knew that they hit consistently and they hit pretty hard usually most of the time. So if I need to hear that snare top mic, I want to hear that snare bottom. All right, last but not least, compression. Now you'll see this one looks a little bit different. This is still 1176, but this is a silver face 1176, also known as the blue stripe. It doesn't have the blue stripe on this graphic for some reason, but it is a blue stripe. And all the differences between the black one and the silver one is just what years they came out. And the components were just a little bit different. They had a little bit of a different sound to them. Nothing terribly different, but enough that like there's some characteristics to it that you'll notice if you spend more and more time with listening to these things. I personally like this silver face on the snare bottom just because I find that the crackle and the sparkle that it has suits well with the snare bottom mic. So let's listen. It's not doing a whole lot here. It's just kind of just keeping the hits consistent and just gluing it together. So let's listen to it in context with the snare top. And I don't always run these together at Unity. I actually will dig this down. Without it. With it. It's just it's just there to add just a little bit more of that bottom end of the, of the bottom snare sound to it, just to add a little more of that rattle to it. Let's bring the kick. Okay, we're in a good spot here. Let's go to our toms. We're going to skip our drum sample for today and move on to the toms. So, tom 1, let's take a listen. Okay, so obviously we can hear the snares in there. There's some cymbal bleed in there too, so gate's going to definitely be needed. A little too much of the low end, just a touch, because we don't need all of that sub information going to our subs. I want to reserve that for my kick and my bass. And we'll shape up some of the attack a little bit too. So let's go ahead and grab that high pass filter. And let's just see what our EQ is sounding like today. All right, I'm going to bring the gate in here just so I can hear more of that tom. Now, I'm not super worried about how quickly that attack and release is set here, in that, like, it kind of feels like it's choking some of the life out of it, because I know I have overhead mics that are going to be capturing it too as well. So I'm really using it just for the initial hit and some of that tone coming out of it, but I know my overheads are also picking up that too, and that's going to help me a lot. So what I'm feeling right now is there's a little bit of this weird honkiness at the low mids. Just some like resonant tone. I'm just going to dip just a touch. And I think I want to hear what we're doing here. Yeah. So this stuff here, that 500 range, 400 or 500, 600 range here, we're just going to dip a little bit more here. Okay, before, after, that's feeling good. All right, let's move on to the compressor. Compressor again, 1176. That's just what I'm liking here. There's other options out there too, obviously, and the stock compressor probably would have worked fine in this too, but because I had it, I just went ahead and used it. And I'm getting a lot of that thickness added again that this compressor does such a great job of doing. I think I'm going to speed up the release just a touch. I'm watching that needle there on the VU meter, and I'm seeing it kind of just take its time coming down. I think I want it to go a little bit faster. Yeah, that's feeling good. Okay, cool. We're going to call that. We're going to keep moving here. Let's go to the floor tom. Okay. Very George of the Jungle. Let's look at what EQ I did for this one. So this one, a little bit more carving. So let's actually listen to it, the high pass on. Again, there is going to be a high pass, not because I need to cut out everything, but I'm cutting out about 60 hertz and below, and that's just because that works well on my system. You may be able to get away with a little more low end, but make sure that you're still leaving room for your bass guitar and your kick drum, because they're important too. Okay, let's bring in our EQ here. Interesting. I think I feel like now that I'm hearing it again, I think we cut out a little bit too much of that low end from that 100 hertz range. So let's just add a little bit back. And I want to boost this 250. Yeah, it was here at 260. I'm finding this is not as pleasant to hear. So I'm going to, yeah, that's better. And now we're hearing more of that kind of ring, that low end drone ring that we had. That's what we want. Okay, so all I did was I heard something I didn't feel right, but I knew roughly where it was, which was around that 200 range. So I boosted it so I could hear it and find it and kind of like attenuate it, or excuse me, draw attention to it, I should say. And then I moved it around, found it, pulled it down, and that was it. Now, the big thing I want to make sure you don't do is go frequency finding and finding things that all sound terrible, because if you do that, you will find just about every frequency has something not good in it. And you will start cutting everything, and you're going to lose everything. Do this only when you're trying to find something that you hear without boosting, and then go, okay, where is that at? Use it to find it, kind of like a magnifying glass, and then kill it, and then listen again to what your sound source sounds like. If you hear something else that sounds weird, use that thing to find it, but don't use it to be the thing that finds the problem. Use it to find it when you hear the problem. That makes sense. All right, let's move on to adding that compressor in. Oh, we need to add our gate in. Duh. All right, doing better. Compressor. All right. I feel like we're not getting that thickness that we should. So let's take a look at what we can do here. Let's quicken our release here. And let's go to a 4:1. Let's slow our attack time down. No, let's speed it up. All right, let's try the different compressor here. Okay, interesting. I feel like this has got a little bit more of like an accentuation on the low mids. This smoothed it out. I think we're gonna stick with this one now. I like that better. Really weird that that's what works well, but we're gonna go with it. Okay, let's move on to overheads. I'm gonna start moving things even faster now because I think you're starting to see and hear what I'm getting at, but I'm still gonna try and cover what I am doing. So let's listen to the overheads. Now, again, these were a pair of C214s, and because where we placed them, it's got a really wide image, which you're gonna hear, especially if you're wearing headphones. So let's take a listen. So you'll notice right away, you technically could use these mics almost on their own and not have any close mics and be good. Maybe adding at least your kick drum in because your kick drum's gonna have that sub information. But that's the whole idea here behind the overheads. And I really want to hone in on this because I know for myself, for years, I was raised and taught and learned that overhead microphones were just for cymbals. And it's just not true. Yes, you can use them for cymbals, and there are times where it makes sense to use them just for cymbals. In fact, some people use overheads and dedicated cymbal mics. But the better use I find personally using overhead mics is to capture the sound of the drum kit as a whole, and you get the life of it. You get the actual sound of it breathing, the air moving around the kit. You hear all of that and feel all of that. And then when you blend in the close mics to get the punch and the thickness and the attention of each part individually blended in with the overhead mics, that's when the drum kit sounds really good. So that was just without any processing applied to it. So let's actually take a look at what we can do to help make this sound even better. So the first things first is, while I do like the fact that we heard everything in the kit, I don't need all that sub information in there and that low information there because I know that I'm getting that covered by some of those close mics. So first things first is going to be a good old high pass filter, which in this case is set to 260. So let's listen to what it sounds like before. So now we're focusing on the toms, the snare, and the cymbals. Now you'll see here I've got quite some aggressive EQ getting ready to be applied here. Let's just listen to it before we judge what it looks like. Okay, so what happened here exactly? So when I went to actually EQ these overheads, what I actually did was I would listen to all of my close mics with the overheads on, and then I took just the overhead EQ and applied all my changes to it while listening to it in the context of the rest of the kit. The reason I did that is because I wanted the overheads to be an accompaniment with those close mics and vice versa. So I used this time to just kind of dial in what felt like was too much and too little. And it really meant just cutting quite a bit of most things. And that was all it took, was just cutting these things out. So let's listen to it again before with that EQ out. And I'm actually going to bring in everything. And let's bring in the EQ. And let's kill the overheads. Did you feel the difference there? Let's listen again. So no EQ, overheads on. Remember, this is what it sounds like without the overheads on. We just got really close all of a sudden, right? Now we can feel everything. We opened up and boom. Now everything's got a place to sit because we cut out all those big bands that just needed to be shaped and toned. Now we can take it a step further here and we can add some compression just to kind of glue it all together. So we're going to go to, you guessed it, 1176. That's just what sounded great on this. So I've got a silver face option here and we've got the attack cranked because I wanted to use it to grab those initial transient hits of the snare and the toms and let the close mics actually be what you hear first. So it's going to duck the overheads out of the way when those get hit and then open them back up to let us hear the rest of it. So let's just listen to it. Take it out again. Back in. I don't know if you felt that, but suddenly like everything in the kick, snare, and toms just had a place all of a sudden. They just like, boom, they're right there. And there's just like this energy, this thickness that just kicked into our whole drum kit. Again, no overheads. Overheads. Now you'll notice that our VU meter here on the gain reduction to show you how much is being cut only really kicks in when the snare or toms are being hit. And that's typically because they're the loudest thing in that whole kit. The cymbals aren't going to be trickling it as much. Now if our cymbals mics were, or if our overhead mics were right next to the cymbals, maybe a little bit more. But generally speaking, these overhead mics are picking up those snares and toms, the loudest thing. So they're going to grab it first. So we take advantage of that by cranking the attack up and letting it be kind of that transient grabber to make room for the close mics to come out. And then when cymbals are hit, they are at a nice even level compared to the snare and toms. Okay, so let's listen to what that all sounds like together. And then we're going to add in two more little things here. I know this has been a long video. We're almost done with this, but we're going to add two more things after this, which is going to be some parallel compression and a little bit of reverb. So let's first listen to building that mix again one more time from scratch, just raising faders because we've already got our sounds dialed in. Let's put everything together. And I'm going to go ahead and bring my overheads because I know my kicks, I kind of usually want it to be there at all times. But my overheads, I want to hear more what that context feels like. Bring the snare. Too much bottom in there. Okay, let's bring in the toms. Now, if we want to go a quick step further, what we could do is pan our toms a little bit. So I know tom 1 was to the left, I want to say, and tom 2 was to the right. I'm actually not going to do a full... Cool. All right, cool. That's sounding great. Let's add in some drum reverb. Now, I've got my drum reverb programmed to where I've got a little bit of everything going into that reverb because I'm using it less as an effect to make it sound like this big, huge cathedral sounding drum kit, but more just to kind of make it feel like it's in the room since we've got it in a cage. So let's listen to what that sounds like. Oh, now, I did notice something I turned off I wanted to show you, and that is the EQ. So let's turn that EQ on. And you can see I've cut a lot of low information out, and I've ducked a little bit of 16K out because it's just a little too bright. Just because the snare seems to kind of trickle in there a little too far. Now, just to go over my reverb settings here, because I know someone's going to want to know what they are, and I'm going to tell you right now that this is not my favorite reverb. I'm not a huge fan of the reverbs on this board, but I can make them work with what I need to do just by spending time with them and tweaking them, which I probably tweak these about once a month. So let's talk about real quickly what I use. So I actually pulled up a preset from this board and started with it. And all I've done really is just kind of just tweak things. So pre-delay, which is, how quickly does that reverb start after the initial sound goes into the system. I've got set to the max as quick as it can, just because I want it to kind of just be a part of the drum kit sound. I want to make it feel like we're bringing the drum kit into the room without it feeling like it's out of the cage, if that makes sense. I want to keep it controlled, but I want to have control of how much volume there is in the room, but also still feel like it's in the room with us, if that makes sense. Decay time, I've got about almost 3 seconds. High frequency decay and high frequency slip. Those are kind of settings that I don't know exactly on this unit what they do. I've just kind of tweaked them to what sounded best. Low frequency cut and high frequency cut, these are just to help shape the tone going into the reverb. So what I've done is I've cut off 85 hertz and below and 6.5 hertz or kilohertz and above roughly. Those are just frequencies that I didn't feel like I needed to go into the reverb unit. And then as you saw on the EQ, I actually took even more out in the back end because I didn't want all of that information. So that's okay to put EQ in before and after. It just kind of depends on what sounds best to you. This was something that came by trial by error. I spent time with doing no adjustments on the high cuts and low cuts on the reverb unit and just doing EQ in the back end. I spent time doing the opposite. And then I figured out both sounded probably the best in this room. And so that's what we've stuck with. Now let's move on to a little secret sauce here. This is the Mighty compressor, which this is another style of old vintage compression that I don't believe there's a specific model it's after because they've kind of combined a couple different ones. Same with some of the other compressors on this board. But essentially, this is a compressor to destroy your sound. And the reason why you might want to do this is to add a touch more thickness. Compression can add thickness to your sound very easily if used correctly. So in this instance, this compressor here is being used to squash and smash all of the transient information out of our toms and snare and just absolutely destroy it. But on its own, it sounds bad, but together in a mix, it sounds great. So let's take a listen to it as we blend it in. Before I even bring it in, you can see on the meter here, we're getting a ton of reduction, almost 10 dB worth. So we're smashing it. So I took it out there, bring it back in. It's just kind of adding just a little bit more thickness to things without, needing the ability to do it on the individual channel. Because what's cool is that I can take it out now on a single fader if I need things to not be as thick. Maybe it's a softer song, a softer moment. I don't need that thickness all the time. So it's there as a fader that I can bring in and out, and I can blend it to taste. So that, my friends, was drums. That was a lot to go through. And I mean, you got to think about it here. There's 8+ channels here that we're working with. So there's a lot of time and effort that needs to be spent here. But once we dial this in, everything else is going to fall into place because they're going to have a place to go. Drums cover so much of the range of the band, from timekeeping elements to even having some of their tones covering some of what could be a note or two from the instruments that play along with it that we need to make sure we have room for. So next, we're going to go to drum's best friend, which is the bass guitar, and then their best friends, the guitars and acoustics. So let's dive into those next.